Even though it has been many years, I remember my encounter with him as if it were just yesterday. Back then, I lived with my mother in a small, cozy house in the suburbs. It was the house I grew up in. I had lived alone for a few years in between. But when Mom became too old to take care of herself, I moved back in to support her. It wasn't always easy. In her old age, she would have phases of seemingly inexplicable bad moods. Secretly, I always suspected that she was just frustrated because her body was deteriorating. Even though she didn't feel old in her mind, she relied on help for many things. But on that evening, her bad mood wasn't caused by any frustration. "I'm back," I called out after closing the door behind me. "Hello," I added when no one responded. Finally, I found Mom in the kitchen. She was sitting on her chair, staring off into space. "Mom, is everything okay?" I asked, worried. Why wasn't she responding? Finally, she lifted her head, her eyes fixed on me for a second before she weakly said, "Hi." Then she looked down again. I paused. There was an expression in her eyes that I rarely saw in her. "Hey, what happened?" I asked as I sat down on the chair next to her. I cautiously placed my hand on hers. She pulled it away. Suddenly, her expression changed. "Leave me alone," she hissed. She glared at me. "Even if I told you, you wouldn't believe me." Offended, she looked away. I sighed. So it was something supernatural. Mom had always believed in nonsense like angels, demons, and ghosts. But at least that meant it couldn't be anything serious. So I didn't have to worry. Although it certainly felt very real to Mom. "What's wrong?" I asked calmly. Mom hesitated. She glanced at me out of the corner of her eye before turning to face me again. She seemed to consider whether she should actually tell me. "Well," she said weakly, "but you have to promise me that you won't ridicule me. This time, it's not like the other things. It's about something I've seen before. He watches me while I sleep. He sneaks into my room at night." My mouth went dry. "Someone sneaks into your room at night?" I asked, concerned. Why would I mock her for that? Mom shook her head. "This thing is not someone. It's something else, something evil, dark, and I can feel it in my bones. Tonight, it won't just watch me." I stared at her with wide eyes. Should I call the police?" I asked hesitantly. Mom snorted. "They can't help either. I already told you. It's not a human. It's the rake," she explained ominously, as if the name should mean something to me. "The rake?" I asked skeptically. "And this rake sneaks into your room at night?" She nodded. "He observes people. I don't know what he wants from us, but it's nothing good." "And how do you know all of this?" I asked. I was sure she must have just read something about it. Or maybe watched a movie about this rake. "I've seen him," she whispered softly. "Many years ago, I saw him. He crouched next to my bed when I woke up at night. Since then, I feel his presence every night." She sounded weak as she said that. It was probably just a nightmare, I thought to myself. However, I didn't voice the thought to avoid starting an argument. Instead, I offered to make both of us a calming tea. Afterward, we changed the subject. Mom talked about a detective movie she had watched in the afternoon, although I was sure she had already told me the plot of the same movie a few months ago. I didn't point it out to avoid upsetting her mood again. It was only when it was time for her to go to bed that the topic of the rake came up again. "No," she protested. "I can't go to sleep. That's when he comes. He will do something to me." I had rarely seen Mom so upset. When I tried to help her up, she resisted with all her might. It took a lot of coaxing and persuasion. It was only when I promised her that I would keep our doors open and the lights on so she could just call me if something was wrong, that she finally agreed to go to bed. I wished her a good night and gave her a kiss on the forehead. Then I made a round through the house to make sure that all the windows and doors were locked. When I checked on her again, she was already asleep. Since I was pretty exhausted from the long day myself, I decided to go to bed as well. However, I couldn't resist Googling the rake before that. I immediately found results. He crouched at the foot of my bed. His eyes stared at me as if they could see right through me. His skin appeared almost white in the faint light from the hallway. Naked, he hunched there in a crouched position, like an animal waiting for its prey. His eyes glowed in the darkness, like those of a cat that could see in the dark. I was completely motionless. My heart raced. Was I still dreaming? No, I had never felt so awake. Maybe it was one of those sleep paralysis episodes where you're supposed to see monsters. But no, I could move. Suddenly, the rake flinched as if my movement had startled him. He emitted a sound that resembled the howling of a dog before slowly crawling towards me. I felt his bony hand through the blanket on my leg. I hastily pulled it back. Sitting with my knees to my chest, I was frozen. Cold sweat ran down my entire body. Then the rake reached me. He crouched right in front of me. A slightly putrid smell filled my nostrils. I could only assume it was his breath escaping through his slightly open mouth. Thoughts raced through my mind. What would the rake do? Would he attack? Should I attack first? Should I try to escape? For a moment that felt like an eternity. We both sat completely motionless, staring at each other. Then, the rake suddenly jerked his head around. Before I knew what was happening, the rake had already leaped off the bed and scurried on all fours into the hallway. His hands and feet made slapping sounds as they hit the tiles, while the rake disappeared from sight. I sat on my bed, petrified. Did that really just happen? Maybe it was just a strangely realistic dream. After all, the rake was just an invention. An internet myth. Then a piercing scream cut through the silence. "Mom," I shouted. As quickly as I could, I followed the rake into her room. When I reached it, he lunged at me. The force of the impact knocked me to the ground before the rake disappeared somewhere behind me. The red marks left by his hands on the tiles indicated that he had run toward the entrance door. I ignored it. As swiftly as possible, I got back up. I rushed to Mom's bedside. She was breathing heavily. Her entire body was covered in injuries that looked like scratches and bite marks. Without hesitation, I reached for Mom's phone on her nightstand and dialed emergency services. But help arrived too late. Before the ambulance arrived, Mom took her last breath. When the police finally arrived, I desperately tried to explain to them what had happened. However, they didn't even listen properly or believe me. After all, I was in shock. I overheard them launching a search for an unknown, naked man, but I knew it wasn't a man. It was the rake. Mom had been right. That thing wasn't human, and I knew for certain that he would come back. I knew that one night, I would again gaze into his cold, glowing eyes, just like Mom had known. It was shortly after Christmas when my friends and I had a sleepover party. We had been planning it for months. Mike had volunteered to host the party at his place. He lived on a farm near a gloomy forest. He thought it would be fun, especially if we told scary stories. In the end, everyone agreed, although some hesitated. On the day of the party, everyone brought food and drinks, and we made ourselves comfortable. It had been dark outside for a while, and the old clock on the wall struck 12. Mike was eager to tell the first story. It was about a ghost that waited in the walls until you fell asleep, and then night after night, it would choose its victims and kill them without anyone noticing. Many of us were creeped out. Even those who didn't believe the story felt a shiver run down their spine when a prolonged creak came from the wall behind Mike. Mike grinned and looked at me, signaling that it was my turn next. I trembled slightly with fear and didn't realize that I had tucked myself under the blanket. However, an old legend about the nearby gloomy forest immediately came to mind. It is said that a ghost lurks there, seeking revenge on all people out of sorrow. Exactly 100 years ago, people had kidnapped and killed his wife. However, an old legend about the nearby gloomy forest immediately came to mind. It is said that a ghost lurks there, seeking revenge on all people out of sorrow. Exactly 100 years ago, people had kidnapped and killed his wife. For one girl in our group, this story was too much, and she decided to be picked up. The rest of the group stayed, although their fear was clearly visible. Around 3 o'clock, everyone had fallen asleep. I was in a half sleep when I heard the door open. I opened my eyes slightly, but the door had already closed again. So I tried to fall back asleep, but then there was this faint wheezing sound in the room. I was sure it hadn't been there before. I turned to Sophie, who was lying next to me, and tapped her lightly. "Hey, are you awake?" I whispered so softly that I couldn't even understand myself properly. She turned to me and replied in a slightly annoyed voice, "Yeah, I am. What's up?" "Do you hear that?" I answered quietly. It was silent for about a minute. This time, I couldn't even hear the wheezing anymore. "No, and now go to sleep," she said in an even more irritated tone. When I was sure she had fallen asleep, this time I heard shuffling footsteps accompanying the wheezing. It was as if someone was walking in slippers without lifting their feet. Gathering all my courage, I sat up and sprinted towards the light switch. Just before reaching it, I felt a cold draft on my face. It must have been the breath of that ghost, I thought. I pressed the light switch and turned around, but there was nothing. Only my friends, slowly waking up. Then I saw it. A knife was stuck in the blanket of the friend who was sleeping by the door, soaked in blood. One of us screamed loudly. It was followed by more and more screams. Click. The light went out. Out of reflex, I turned around and desperately pressed the light switch. But the light wouldn't come on. "Hey, what's going on? This isn't funny," Mike shouted in my direction. "I don't know what's happening." The light went out on its own. "Did you see the shadow outside the window?" exclaimed the girl who started screaming first. A few of us with trembling voices said, "Yes, that was just the shadow of a tree." Mike reassured us, but they hadn't seen the knife, I thought to myself. "No, they didn't," a raspy voice whispered to me from behind. I ran back to my bed as fast as I could and sat as close as possible to the nearest person. "Hush," I said. And everything became quiet. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps sounded different this time. "Whoever it is, they better stop. This is going too far." The girl who screamed first couldn't finish her sentence. All that was heard was the slow, pleasurable sound of a knife being pulled out of her body. One by one, everyone screamed, but they fell silent in the same order until only I and the person next to me were left. It was quiet. 30 minutes. 1 hour, I can't tell. A lot of time passed when the person next to me asked in the softest and most trembling voice what that was. I was about to answer when they were yanked away with a scream. The sound of something that resembled a body being torn apart could be heard. Thud. Something flew next to me. Slowly and full of fear, I reached for it. I felt something hairy, long hair or something like that. I quickly withdrew my hand when I realized it was her head. Suddenly, I felt something behind me. A faint, cold, unpleasant, and cruel breath. I turned around as slowly as possible. As I turned, long, hairy fingers wrapped around my head. The last thing I remember was my head being slowly turned until my neck snapped. I sat up abruptly, drenched in sweat. A huge weight was lifted off my chest as I realized it was all just a dream. But to be sure, I waited until I could make out the outlines of my friends on their mattresses. I lay back down and tried to fall asleep. That wasn't a dream. Something whispered in my ear,